Good afternoon. It's Thursday, the 15th of March 2018, and I'm going to read you a letter that was written today from Shy Society to the Prime Minister of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the Right Honourable Mrs. Theresa May. Dear Prime Minister, this week you asked us to take your word that it was Russia who was behind the murder in Salisbury. Since then, you're probably wondering why a proportion of Britons don't believe you. Maybe this lack of trust comes from the legacy of Tony Blair when he dragged us into a bloody war on the premise that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. And yes, this might be part of it. Excuse me. However, the real reason why we don't trust you or your government is because you don't trust the British people, and trust, after all, is a two-way thing. It's not just you who doesn't trust us. It's the entire political, media and state establishment, and this has been going on for at least 20 years. There have been several recent incidents which highlight this lack of trust. Firstly, and by far the worst, were the horrific revelations by the Sunday Mirror on the scale of child rape, assault and murder that has taken place and, according to the Mirror, is still taking place in the town of Telford, Shropshire. The BBC didn't carry the story until, on receiving a huge amount of criticism, they eventually published a small article on the BBC Shropshire homepage a full 36 hours after the story broke. Secondly, the arrest, detention and deportation of 3 Conservative activists last weekend: Martin Sellner, Brittany Pettibone and Lauren Southern, Austrian, United States and Canadian citizens respectively. Now, there's a lot of commentary on the online media about this attack on freedom of speech, including on our website, Shy Society, so we're not going to go into huge detail here. Suffice to say that they were deported because they were perceived to be far right and were ironically going to attend a rally in support of freedom of speech to be held at Speaker's Corner in London, and you, or the Home Secretary Amber Rudd, didn't want them to be heard by British people. Well, that worked out well, didn't it? You didn't want Sellner, Pettibone or Southern in the UK because you knew that the Sunday Mirror would be publishing the details of what had happened at Telford. And you knew that this would be the worst of dozens of similar cases where children as young as 9 have been systematically groomed, sexually abused, forced into addiction to drugs and alcohol by their abusers, raped, gang raped, trafficked, beaten, threatened, and in the worst cases murdered by gangs who are predominantly made up of Muslim Pakistani men. You once again assumed that we would react in a violent manner towards British Muslims, so the best way to manage this was not to talk about it and to instruct the security services and the police to crack down on areas of potential far-right hate. In other words, areas where people were voicing legitimate dissent and peaceful protest and concern. Why is it, Mrs. May, that you don't trust the British people? You see, the only reason we can come up with as to why British authorities and media behave this way is that you have such a low opinion of us that you think that if we know the truth or discuss it in public, then we will form lynch mobs, head down to the local grocer's shop, drag poor old Mr. Ahmed out by his beard and string him up from the nearest lamppost. The reality is that the British people are compassionate and tolerant people. Despite provocation, every time extremist adherents to the religion of peace carry out an atrocity either here or elsewhere. Peter McLaughlin, in his 2015 book Easy Meat, Inside Britain's Grooming Gang Scandal, which, Prime Minister, if you haven't read, you really should do, quotes the Association of Chief Police Officers, who estimate the numbers of children and girls groomed, raped, beaten and threatened by rape gangs, mostly of Pakistani heritage, was in the region of 100,000. Despite the colossal failing of the state and criminal justice system to protect children, never once have we descended into the vengeful vigilante mob you appear to think we're capable of. In the one terrible instance when a disturbed man drove his van into a crowd, leaving a mosque, resulting in the tragic death of Mr. Makram Ali, aged 51, The response from the government and mainstream media, especially the BBC, Guardian and Sky News, was almost euphoric. At last, you were able to justify your increasingly tyrannical attacks on our freedom of speech. At last, you were able to point to far-right terrorism. And at last, you were able to justify the interminable prevent briefings where employees and students have to sit through hours on the danger of far-right and Islamophobia and 5 minutes on Islamism, where we hear Home Secretary Amber Rudd inform us that if we dare watch any far-right propaganda online, we could face 15 years in prison. Because, of course, I suppose it's the far-right who are mobilised as an organised terrorist force in this country. It's the far-right who are whipping up hatred of other faiths and minority groups. It's the far-right who are the real threat. And do you want to know who the far-right are? Well, Prime Minister, they're people like us. They're people who are fed up of being treated as bigoted scum by the establishment, who are fed up of the government's inability to confront Islamist terror and radicalisation, or even have an adult discussion about it. Fed up with the being nudged and lied to by the BBC and other media. Fed up of being called racist for voicing perfectly legitimate concerns about our society. We're fed up of people being arrested at the rate of 9 per day for hate speech. The far-right Prime Minister aren't far-right at all. They are concerned British voters, usually voters who often vote Conservative, and voters who are deeply concerned about the future of the country and the nation that we are building as a legacy to our children. Is it any wonder that the British people no longer trust those who govern them when you refuse to trust us with the truth? And of course, we get the truth anyway because we get it through the internet. The Home Secretary may have congratulated herself on stopping the 3 Conservative activists from speaking in the UK, but all she really achieved was to show the world the dismal state of freedom of speech in the UK. Mrs May, you do not trust us to be able to have an adult and reasoned debate about this. It's hardly surprising, though, when we are watched at by CCTV cameras, when our internet use is monitored by security services, when we are told by high-profile Remainers that we're too stupid and shouldn't have been trusted to make a rational decision on Brexit, let alone have the vote, when British parents are doubted by the schools that educate their children, when they phone up to inform the school their child is too sick to attend and are invited to attend intervention sessions by teaching staff to discuss concerns. They are smeared and prosecuted when they object to the political indoctrination of their children at school or universities. We are not trusted with our health. We are not trusted with our ability to conduct ourselves in a civilized manner. We are not trusted to eat or drink in a healthy manner. We are not trusted to go to football matches and sing songs. We are not trusted with the truth because they think we're going to form a lynch gang. We are told that we are racist and misogynists because we don't indulge the postmodern neo-Marxist nonsense infesting our institutions, which teach of white privilege and the patriarchy. We are criminalized for our opinion to the extent of 9 arrests per day for hate crimes. In other words, speaking your mind. Is it any wonder we don't trust you when successive governments have failed to protect hundreds of thousands of children from rape and child abuse by members of a community who were invited into our country by Tony Blair without telling us he was going to do so and without a democratic mandate to do so? Is it any wonder that we don't trust you when you deport right-wing Conservative activists? Right-wing was a description used in Brittany Pettibone's letter. Mrs May, you and Mrs Rudd are right-wing. Is it any wonder that we don't trust you when you deport right-wing Conservative activists under the justification that they are right-wing and could harm community relations, when the hard left thugs of anti-fascist organisations carry out politically motivated physical assaults in broad daylight on London streets, and when the police, despite being provided with the evidence of those responsible for these assaults, do nothing Maybe because they're too busy trawling the internet, reading articles like this one to see if they can come and arrest anyone at Shy Society for hate crime or upsetting people with their words. When you knowingly let nearly 500 ISIS fighters back into our country and where there's an estimated 60,000 jihadis currently roaming our streets. Mrs. May, if you had any respect for the British people, you would not be restricting freedom of speech. You would not be behaving like a tyrant. You would instead be trusting our sense of fair play and common sense and allowing the people of Britain, who have never once given you cause not to trust them, to debate these issues openly, as we have always done. That is the principle of democracy, Mrs. May, and it appears that you and your Westminster colleagues of all parties have become so used to governing by ministerial decree rather than parliamentary debate that you have forgotten the purpose of debate and unrestricted freedom of speech. I'm sorry to say that we no longer recognise the country that we were born into. We are governed by politicians who listen more to lobbyists and political activists from the radical left than they listen to voters. We can't complain because anyone who's a moderate conservative or objects to the assault on our freedoms of speech or who voices concern about what's happening to our society is shunned into silence, threatened to be punished by the process of criminal justice system, and which is facilitated by you, your government, and the agencies that act on behalf of you. You better build more prisons, Mrs. May, because you are currently criminalising the silent majority of Britons, and many of these people voted for you. Yours faithfully, C.J. Strachan.